Hi everyone, I wanted to talk to you about Chapter 10. It is noteworthy that Chapter 10 begins with addressing that animals had rights in this country before children did. As a matter of fact, in the case of Mary Ellen, this argument was used that a child was an animal and therefore had rights like animals did. And as a result, that is when Mary Ellen was able to be pulled out of the home away from her parents and they were put in jail. And then after this, it wasn't until 1961 that the subject of child abuse received national attention again. And it was even later in the 70s that public law, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, was passed. That is Public Law 93-247. And this signified a major turning point for child abuse cases in terms of children's rights. So this public law mandates that states establish a central agency with legal authority to investigate and prosecute incidences of abuse and neglect. Now, for us, we are mandated reporters. We are not required to provide evidence of suspected neglect or an abuse, only suspicions. That's why it's called allegations, and the allegations have to be investigated. We as educators are not the deciding entity as to whether or not an instance is in fact child abuse or neglect. More often than not, we will not have a crystal clear indicator that we need to make the call, but there's going to be a combination of events that add up, an accumulation of events maybe, and those circumstances that may lead us to suspect that abuse or neglect is occurring in the home. So your checklist on page 272 of your textbook talks about identifying signs of abuse and neglect. And one of the criteria that's on that checklist mentions that the child seems unusually fearful of adults, especially parents. So one of the very first cases that I dealt with as a manager in terms of child abuse, I had a child that I was working with, and he was very preoccupied with when his mother would return to pick him up. He wasn't scared. He didn't appear to be scared, but he was always very curious about her whereabouts when she was coming to pick him up. And when she originally came into the program, the way she set the stage with me is that she said she had just been hired for a job and that she needed care for her son. She was very hesitant to drop him off at my facility because in the past he had been abused at a daycare center. So I took some time with her, gave her a tour of the facility, gave her the chance to meet the teachers, and invited her to visit the program at any time. And of course, communicated to her that I felt it was really important that she feel comfortable with the facility before she even considered accepting a slot in the program. And she did eventually accept a slot in the program. And as we came to know the family, she was nothing but delightful with a very sweet child. And then things started to change. One morning in particular, when she brought him in dragging him by his hair. And when she was in the lobby, she just kind of tossed him and then kicked him. And didn't even take him to his room, but she just left the facility, which was just as good that she left. She needed to be gone. So the point behind this story is that, of course, that is a clear-cut instance of when you need to pick up the phone and call Child Protective Services and get the ball in motion. That's immediate, all right? My point to you is that you typically don't have those situations. Another situation that I had was when a preschool-aged child came into our program for, part day preschool program, and her teacher asked her about the mark on her face because it looked like a handprint. And she said that, my mommy slapped me because I would not clean up my room. So that is another clear-cut instance of when you're going to pick up the phone and call Child Protective Services. And again, these are circumstances or situations that are few and far between. Typically, you're going to have more gray area than not, but that goes back to what I was talking to you about before. You don't have to prove it. You have to report your allegations or suspicions in conjunction with or in line with your training, what you've been trained on to report, the signs and symptoms you've been trained to look for. So those are two clear-cut examples. All the other times that I've had to call Child Protective Services are examples of when I've had to use my best judgment and call upon my training to report allegations that may be questionable. And again, I wasn't the deciding entity on whether or not that situation was abuse or neglect. Child Protective Services was. That is their job. That is their role. And just because we are mandated reporters, I want to take a moment to recognize this. Just because we're mandated reporters, that doesn't mean that automatically makes our job easier. You know, you may be questioning yourself and thinking, well, what if when I report, what if that makes the situation escalate? And, well, what if it does? But what if you don't report and the situation continues to escalate and it unfortunately and very drastically results in a child's death? Then what? So you may be questioning yourself and you're talking yourself out of it, but just, I hate to say go with your gut, but call upon your training and know that you need to report those instances where you have suspicions of child abuse or neglect. Additionally, a staff member may hesitate to report because, let's say, a staff member sees the manager of the program and they're like, oh, you were busy talking to someone, or you were with a parent, you were with your boss, I didn't want to interrupt, or it's Friday at 4 o'clock and I'm leaving town. I'm leaving town for the weekend. I'm not going to be here and you weren't available to talk to me. Well, you know, that's a really good example of when staff members need to be trained to call a manager at home or to insist that, you know, I need to speak with you now. This is regarding a child. And as soon as you recognize that as a manager, that you get the word that this is regarding a child's safety, then that is when you do drop everything, regardless of what it is that you're doing, so that you can address the matter at hand, because it does take precedence over all other matters. And I know you may be thinking, why did she even mention that? That's common sense. And I agree with you. You know, it is common sense, but sometimes people may use excuses to delay reporting or not report, hoping that situations will improve themselves on their own. And we know that they won't. But for whatever reason, staff hesitate too much when it comes to reporting these allegations. Another situation that may give you pause is that, let's say you know that a certain family has been reported before and nothing has happened. You are still obligated to report each and every time it fits the definition of when you should report. And furthermore, you may think that you may know about interventions, but often you are not in a position to know exactly what sort of intervention has occurred. Maybe no intervention has occurred. But don't stop reporting if other allegations are happening. You need to report each and every one. So lastly, you may be wondering how you can be protected if a family decides to pursue an action against you because you filed a false allegation. You have some excellent suggestions in your textbook, including teachers not being alone with a group of children. Hopefully you have cameras in your facility. You're conducting those daily health checks and you're documenting anything that is out of the ordinary, especially any sort of statement that the child gives. So you're going to have that documentation on file. And of course, the training that you receive, you're going to have that documentation as well. You know, what were you trained on specifically? So you can illustrate that you acted in accordance with the things that you have been trained on. So that is important in terms of protecting yourself against what could potentially be said about you filing a false allegation against a parent. And ultimately, the TED Talk that you watched this week on a call to connection should always inspire you to be the advocate for the child, because as Dr. Allison Jackson says, it took that one person who was there in her corner as an advocate of change and hope for her. And just think how, if that one person would not have been there for her, certainly her life could have taken a completely different turn. So We want to be that one person for all these children that we care for. I'll leave you with that. Thank you for your attention.